Hello again, 102, and what were some criticisms of the New Deal and New Deal America in Chapter 23? It's criticized by politicians and individuals from both the left of the political spectrum and from the right, as we'll see. Although the programs making up the first New Deal helped ease the devastation caused by the Depression continued to exact a terrible toll as the shattered economy slowly worked its way back to health. As late as 1939, as we'll see, some 9.5 million workers, 17% of the labor force, remained unemployed, which means that the legacy economically of the New Deal is mixed at best. And there were some problems with discrimination and with the impact of groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Black Cabinet. However progressive FDR was on social issues, he showed little interest in the plight of African Americans, even as black voters by 1936 are shifting from the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, who had set the slaves free. They're shifting to the Democratic Party, and President Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson before him, failed to address long-standing patterns of racism and segregation. We're way too early for that to happen. That's not going to be until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, because we don't want to anger conservative Southern Democrats who still control the Democratic Party. As a result, many of the New Deal programs discriminated against blacks because they're run by Southerners. For example, payments from the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to farm owners to take land out of production in an effort to raise prices. It forced hundreds of thousands of tenant farmers and sharecroppers, both blacks and whites, off the land. And meanwhile, the Federal Housing Administration refused to guarantee mortgages on houses purchased by blacks in white neighborhoods. In addition, both the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority practiced racial segregation, which is segregation is the law of the land in the 1930s since Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People waged an energetic legal campaign against racial prejudice throughout the 1930s, as did Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady convinced the President to appoint more African Americans to government positions than ever before, and one of the most visible of the new appointees was Mary McLeod Bethune, the child of former slaves from South Carolina, who had founded Bethune-Cookman College in Florida and had served as the head of the NAACP in the 1920s. In 1935, Roosevelt appointed her as the director of the Division of Negro Affairs within the National Youth Administration, an agency that provided jobs to unemployed young Americans, such as Lyndon Baines Johnson and Richard Milhouse Nixon, as we'll see. The Scottsboro Boys' famous Supreme Court case dealing with prejudice against blacks in the South, and it's vividly revealed in this case. In 1931, an all-white jury on flimsy evidence hastily convicted 9 black males, ranging from age 13 to 21, of raping 2 young white women who were prostitutes. They were selling their services on the train. And 8 of the Scottsboro Boys were sentenced to death as whites in the courtroom cheered. No case in American legal history ever produced as many trials, appeals, reversals, and retrials as the much publicized Scottsboro case. Further, it prompted 2 important legal interpretations. In Powell versus Alabama in 1932, the United States Supreme Court overturned the original convictions in the case because the judge had not ensured that the accused were provided with adequate defense attorneys. This is a precedent for Gideon v. Wainwright that comes up in the early 1960s that will finally codify this completely. And the court orders new trials. In another case of Norris versus Alabama, the court ruled that the systematic exclusion of African Americans from Alabama juries had denied the Scottsboro defendants equal protection under the law. a key component of the dormant 14th Amendment, a principle that had then huge impact on state courts by opening up juries to blacks. Eventually, it was too late to help these defendants. Their lives are ruined. The state of Alabama dropped the charges against the 4 youngest of the Scottsboro boys and granted paroles to the others. The last one was released from prison in 1950. And here is the famous picture of their attorney. Samuel Leibowitz was a New York City Jewish attorney who offered his services, and he came down and faced heavy discrimination and abuse while he was defending some of the Scottsboro boys. Indian New Deal, the Great Depression also ravaged them. They were initially encouraged by Roosevelt's appointment of John Collier as Commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and Collier steadily increased the number of Native Americans employed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he ensured that Native Americans gained access to various federal relief programs. His primary objective was the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act. It was designed to reinvigorate Native American cultural traditions by restoring the land to the tribes, and the proposed law would grant them the right to start businesses and establishing self-governing constitutions, and to provide federal funds for vocational training and economic development. But the act that was finally passed was a much diluted version of the original, and the Indian New Deal brought only partial improvement to the lives of Native Americans. Yet it did spur various tribes to revise their constitutions so as to give women the right to vote and hold office. Huey Long is a big threat from the left. He was a very powerful and shrewd lawyer, product of Louisiana State University, and a consummate politician. He's the most potent threat to Roosevelt. He claimed to serve the poor, first as Louisiana's governor and then as its most powerful U.S. senator, 2 positions he held simultaneously for a while. He came to view the state as his personal empire. Reporters called him the dictator of Louisiana. True, he reduced state taxes and improved roads and improved schools, built charity hospitals, and provided better public services, but in the process, he became a bullying dictator who used bribery, intimidation, and blackmail to get his way. And to launch his own presidential candidacy, Long devised a simplistic plan for dealing with the Great Depression, which he called the Share the Wealth Society. He wanted to raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans and to redistribute the money raised to the people, giving every poor family $5,000 and every wage worker an annual income of $2,500. He wanted to provide pensions to retirees, reduce working hours, paying bonuses to military veterans, and enabling every qualified student to attend college. These schemes did not add up, and it didn't matter. He did not care. He goes, I can outpromise Roosevelt. He's no way that he can compete with me, and people are going to believe me and not him, because he viewed Roosevelt as being a phony. He was the kingfisher. He's a theatrical political performer, a demagogue, and this is what happens in times of crisis, ladies and gentlemen. People will come out of the woods and appeal to the raw emotions of the masses. People are hurting in these days. And these are very appealing promises, as were the Townsend Plan, and from the right, some of the radio broadcasts of Father Coughlin. And here they are. This is Townsend. This is the Reverend Smith and Father Charles E. Coughlin meeting to attend a meeting of the Townsend clubs that are going to come out of Mr. Francis E. Townsend from California, his proposals. Townsend basically wanted to create a pension plan. He wants people over 60 to be retired, and we're going to give them $200 a month, and they have to spend all $200. And he believes that that would spur employment then, because anybody over 60 is going to be retired, and now those positions can be taken by younger people. This plan did not add up either. And Father Coughlin who assailed Roosevelt as the Roman Catholic radio priest from his location in Detroit, Michigan. He claims that Roosevelt is the anti-God, and he claimed that the New Deal was a communist conspiracy. He is criticism from the right, ladies and gentlemen. And during the 30s, he becomes openly anti-Semitic. He claims that Roosevelt was the tool of international Jewish bankers, and Coughlin has an influence on Henry Ford, who also will adopt many of these positions in later life. And finally, the Supreme Court overturns New Deal programs. In Schechter Poultry versus the United States, the justices ruled that the Congress had given too much authority to the executive branch when the National Industrial Recovery Act gave the National Recovery Administration power to bring businesses and labor leaders together to create these codes of fair competition. This is much too much muddling in the economy. And in a press conference soon after the court announced his decision, Roosevelt fumed, "We have been relegated to the horse and buggy definition of interstate commerce." And by the end of its 1936 term, the Supreme Court had ruled against New Deal programs in 7 of 9 major cases. And the same line of conservative judicial reasoning, Roosevelt warned, might endanger other New Deal programs if he did not act swiftly to prevent it, which he will do with his court packing scheme in the next video, the second New Deal.